Okay, so I tried to record the class live, that didn't work. So we're going to try this for section 3.4 for those of you who are at home or couldn't make it to class today. We're going to do section 3.4 on bias, or the name of the actual section in the AP classroom is problems that can occur when sampling. Mainly, we're going to talk about bias in the sampling methods. If this works well, I'll try to do another video on sampling methods, the lessons that we did earlier from this unit. Bias is a systematic exclusion of certain elements of your population when you're doing your sample, when you're collecting your data, when you're measuring your variables. You systematically exclude certain parts of your population from the ability to participate in the sample. So that ends up skewing your results. It can be intentional or unintentional. It's still biased, considered biased, if certain segment of your population who would respond a certain way or measure a certain way would be excluded. Okay, we have different kinds of bias. Voluntary response bias occurs when you do a sample where your respondents choose or volunteer to participate. People who choose to participate in surveys and samples and things like this, they tend to be people with very strong opinions about whatever it is you're studying. If you were doing a sample, trying to figure out a person's favorite restaurant, and you laid out cards, say in a local gathering place of some sort, say you had a senior citizen center, you want to lay out cards or things that said, fill out this card and tell us your favorite restaurant, McDonald's or Wendy's or Burger King or whatever. And the people who chose to respond would have very strong opinions about the restaurants. But what you may not get is the people who have, you've got a favorite, but it's not really something so passionate that they're passionate about. Voluntary response ends up getting people's opinions who are very polarized on one side of an issue or another. If you think about the Facebook polls or the social media polls that you see all the time, asking you, do you support the president, or do you do this, do you do that? When do you answer those polls? It's when it's something you care about, or most of the people who answer those polls, something you care about. If you go to Fox News and see one of the polls on their website that says, do you support the Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court? Then you're going to get an overwhelming majority, most likely, because people who volunteer are going to be people who are Fox News watchers, who are extremely conservative, and they really want Trump to get the next Supreme Court nomination. If you go to CNBC or MSNBC or CNN and do the same poll, you may get the opposite result, because the people who volunteer to do those polls, who volunteer to respond to those polls, are likely to have a completely different political view than the people who are sitting over there watching Fox News and doing their polls. Undercoverage bias is when certain groups are not included in the sample or are included at a disproportionate amount to their population, a less than proportionate amount to their part of the population. This could occur when you unintentionally exclude certain people. If you are gathering your data and you want to know an estimate for the percentage of the population that's going to vote for Donald Trump in the next presidential election, and you choose to gather your data via Facebook, there are segments of the population who don't use Facebook. Y'all may be a part of that segment. So what happens is, in your sample may not be representative of the population because you have intentionally or unintentionally, however you plan it, excluded a certain group from the sample. And that's what leads to undercoverage bias. Question wording bias is when the question or the vehicle or the way in which you collect the data tends to lead the respondent to answer a certain way. If we're doing the same poll, if we are going to phrase the questions for our survey, if we want honest opinions, we really want to make neutral questions. We may even want to randomly select the order in which we present the candidates. We say, we're doing a survey and say, in the next election, if you could vote, would you vote for Donald Trump or Joe Biden? We may want to randomly decide which person we want to put in front, because having the person's name first may trigger something that leads to favor a response, or having the person's name read last may tend to favor that response over the other. Or you could have a question wording thing where someone who's maybe less than honest or less than sincere, statistician, or who is very, very politically polarized themselves, collecting the data, they may go in and say, would you vote for, if you could vote in the next election, Donald Trump, who led the world's greatest economy up until the point when COVID-19 struck, or would you vote for his opponent, Joe Biden, the child sniffer? That would be question wording bias, where the way you phrase the question tends to cause the respondent to favor one response over another. You would really generally want just a completely neutral question when you're phrasing your questions for your survey or your sample, collecting your data. Something that does not tend to lead. In fact, you may want to go up and just say, hey, we're going to survey 100 people, and we're going to flip a coin every time. And if it lands on heads, we're going to use Donald Trump's name first. And if it lands on tails, we're going to use Joe Biden's name first. So that is not even a part of the question that's going to lead the respondents to respond a certain way. Non-response bias occurs when the people you have randomly selected, or the object you have randomly selected to measure, or the people you have randomly selected to interview, refuse to respond or simply can't be found, located. If you tried to reach voters in, let's say, the Bologna 72173 area code, zip code, then you gathered all the addresses, you gathered all the names from the voter rolls and stuff, and you went out there and you said, hey, all right, we're going to randomly select these people. We got a list of them. We're going to do a random number generator. We're going to choose 100 people in the Bologna 72173 zip code, and we're going to ask them the question: who would you prefer? Who would you vote for if you could vote in the next election, Donald Trump or Joe Biden? Non-response bias would occur when participants refuse to respond. If you've ever answered the phone and had a telephone poll being conducted, you answer the phone, somebody says, hey, we'd like to talk to you about who you're going to vote for in November. A lot of people just hang up. That would be an example where we get non-response bias. The people who hang up may share some common characteristic where they tend to vote a certain way. People use telephone polls all the time, but non-response bias is always a great risk when you're using telephone polls. Not the telephone polls on the street, but telephone polls where you call someone and try to get them to answer a question on your stuff. That's non-response bias when selected participants refuse to respond, or they just can't, the responses can't be collected. Response bias. Response bias occurs when selected participants give dishonest or untrue answers. This could occur for several reasons. It could be the way you phrase the question. It could be the interviewer themselves. You wouldn't want a police officer to walk around interviewing teenage kids on whether or not they use illicit drugs, because answering a police officer with that question would tend to cause those kids who do use drugs to lie, or who break the law for whatever reason. Okay, so there's times when you may be, if you went and interviewed participants at a church and said, have you ever been unfaithful to your spouse? You may, if you were at church asking that question, you may get a different answer than if you had them offer themselves. You were looking for what percentage of people cheat on their spouses. These are ideas of response bias, especially if you interviewed them with their spouse there. You would definitely most likely get dishonest answers from those who cheat on their spouse. Convenience sampling bias. This occurs when you don't use a random selection method to go gather your data. Instead of going through the 72173 area code, you say, hey, you know what? That's going to be hard. I'm going to have to drive a lot. I'm going to burn a lot of gas. I'm going to take a lot of time. I'm going to go knock on doors when people aren't home, and I'm going to have to go back. This is going to be really difficult for me to go out and do a simple random sample where I gather all of the registered voters in the 72173 zip code, and then go out and randomly select them and then go hunt all these people down. That'd be really difficult. So instead, I'm going to go to the next Bologna football game, and I'm going to interview the first 100 people who come through the gate, and I'm going to ask them. And those are going to be my responses. The first 100 people that answer my question, those are going to be my responses. That's an example of a convenience sampling bias, because the people who are attending the Bologna football game may all have some characteristic that causes them to be more prone to vote for Joe Biden or for Donald Trump. So when you select your respondents that way, you end up with a convenient sampling bias. So remember, we've got bias is when you systematically exclude certain elements of your population, or you systematically exclude responses from certain elements of your population, or you inadvertently push people toward a certain response. Bias is anything that basically corrupts the data you collect to give you an untrue or a bad estimate. We have different kinds of bias. Voluntary response bias occurs when your respondents in your poll, or the people you select to measure, or the object you select to measure, are volunteer, choose to participate. Undercoverage bias is when certain groups in your population are not included in your sample, or are included to a lesser extent in their proportion in the population. Question wording bias occurs when your questioning technique, or the questioner or the researcher, whoever's gathering the data, or whatever it is, something about the presentation of the question to solicit the data leads the respondent to answer a certain way. Non-response bias occurs when participants that you randomly selected to interview or to survey or to measure refuse to respond, or can't be reached to respond, or refuse to be married, or can't be reached or measured, or can't be reached to be measured. Response bias occurs when your selected participants give dishonest answers. Think about that drug survey that you took how many times in your high school career, where they ask you 75 different ways, have you smoked marijuana today? There are people who will not answer truthfully because they think the school is going to look at that data and gather that stuff and tell their parents and get them arrested and do all kinds of stuff. Then we have convenience sampling bias, where the sampling method is based on the ease of collecting responses or an ease of gathering the data, and it's not based on random selection. You don't choose your response randomly. Instead, you choose an easy way to get responses, and then you use that data. So that's 3.5, our section on bias or problems that can occur with sampling. We'll post this and see if we can make this work. If this doesn't work well, we'll try to make up a plan C. This is plan B. Thank you. Have a good day.